Do you have friendships where when you meet up, it feels like you're just catching each other up on what's happened in your life since you last spoke? Your relationship, your job, your family, maybe over dinner or a coffee. But right when you finish this debrief, or maybe even before you finished, it's over. You have to catch the train or go back to work, and you never actually really get into anything deeper. And then you get your diaries out to schedule the next catch up, and you realise next time you're both free is over a month away. Again and again and again. So I asked my patrons on Patreon and Discord, is this a thing that you've experienced? And so many people had. That is a catch-up friendship. The earliest use of this phrase I could find within mainstream discussions was a TikTok posted by user Infinite BS, or Bianca, with 2.6 million views. She describes the interaction as one where, before you know it, you've essentially spent 45 minutes interviewing each other like you're on a reality show without really breaking past the surface. It might not be a phrase that you've heard before, but it seems that many of us relate to it. On the surface, it feels like an inevitability in adult life. You aren't in school anymore, where your only responsibility is homework and a few chores before you can go play for hours with your friends. We just have less time. Life moves on. What's wrong with grabbing coffee with a friend? At least we're staying in touch. But I think this one observation is a tip of an iceberg that hints at a looming dark mass beneath the surface, one which exposes the cracks in the shiny veneer of modern life, from the way we're taught about friendship and gender as children to the realities of adult life and loneliness. Because I'd already had conversations about this phenomenon of the catch-up friendship before, we just hadn't thought to name it. And now it was buzzing in the back of my brain. We kept seeing conversations about friendship in crisis everywhere. Articles about the effect of COVID on friendships, the subgenre of I have no friend YouTube videos, the panic of men's loneliness and mental health, the lack of third spaces to spend time socializing, TikToks of girls openly crying because no one showed up to their birthday dinners, and the confusion and isolation they felt because of that. In this video, we're going to dive beneath that surface to see exactly what lurks below, in the hopes of discovering why so many of us feel so alone in a world that's never been more connected, and maybe figure out what we might be able to do to fix it. But before we dive into that, here's a quick ad from Book of the Month that's going to let me talk about this extremely sapphic gothic book. Book of the Month is a way of discovering new books by both established and emerging authors, and you can pick from their amazing hardbacks or audiobooks depending on the type of style that you like to read in. My first choice was Spitting Gold, the aforementioned gay title about a pair of sisters who are also criminals on one last con, also historical fiction set in France, so a very fun mix there. Did I mention seances are also involved? I also picked up Real Americans. I'm a sucker for cross-generational stories, and this one is set in Y2K and also 2021 and has themes of class struggle, race visibility, and also family secrets. The curation team reads hundreds of books each month to narrow them down to a set selection for you, which involves a mix of genres so you can reach beyond what you normally read or the kinds of things that might get recommended to you online already. They already have the best pricing for new release hardbacks, but it's also free shipping, and they have a loyalty program which gives you access to free and discounted books too. Plus, you can track your reading progress in their app, complete challenges, and also leave comments on the books that you've chosen alongside other people who have picked the same. Go to bookofthemonth.com to pick a book and join, and for a limited time only, you can get your first book for just $5 with the code PETALS. Okay, now back to the video. Female friendships. When I was in school, my friendships felt profoundly intense. I endured years of bullying, but I also had a group of close-knit friends, probably pulled together by our shared unpopularity. These friendships solidified further as we entered our teen years, and discovered many of us were queer, or else were supportive enough for it not to matter to our friendships. We talked to each other about crushes and secrets and fears and hopes. We spent as much time together as we could, delighted in our shared interests. We created elaborate ideas for joint fan fiction projects that we never wrote. We were almost always touching, didn't think it odd or strange to hug or slumber across each other or cuddle during sleepovers or sit curled together in the common room at school. But this type of tactile, emotionally vulnerable friendship is not universal. I recently spoke to a guy friend of mine about a topic that runs parallel to this video, the difference between romantic and platonic attractions, especially when sex isn't involved. It's something that I think about a lot as an asexual lesbian, and a topic I'm working on a whole video essay about for later this year. I've asked straight guys about this before, and it usually kind of baffles them, but he replied almost instantly. I've always felt that the women I've known over the years, their friendships together, they honestly already feel romantic to me. For him, he explained, they contained the trust, vulnerability, and emotional depth that he associated with romance. And you know what? I don't think he's wrong. And immediately it called to mind the stereotype about men never getting over their first girlfriend. Not necessarily that they kept being in love with them, but that relationship, the breakup, and the fallout seemed to stay with them in a lasting way, even unconsciously. Because, I realised, almost all the women that I know have a similar experience that they can point to, not about a romantic relationship, but about a friendship from their youth. A girl who broke off their friendship or iced them out of a group or humiliated them in some way. I had that experience, and I know it shaped a lot of my anxieties and self-worth when I was younger. As I was thinking about it, I realised that it made a lot of sense to me. That if a romantic relationship was the first time that these guys were experiencing the kind of tense emotional trust and vulnerability I had in these friendships, that the impacts might be similar. Now, generalising about entire sexes or genders is, not a good area to get into, and to be clear, I do not think that this type of friendship is in a biological imperative of being born with a womb. But in our cis-normative world where gender norms are very much enforced, I think there's something to explore here. So, not wanting this video to be me just theorising about my experiences of friendship, I decided to look at what the research said. Are there differences between how men and women experience friendship? And if so, why does this happen? And is this connected in some way to this friendship crisis that everyone's talking about? The consequences. So let's take a step back, because the consequences of a friendship crisis on an individual and society level feel important to establish here. Why is this worth making a whole video essay about? I say it as if us video essayists need an excuse to make a video essay about something niche and unimportant. So maybe it's more, why should we care? Why should you care? Friendship looks like many different things to different people, but there are some commonalities that let us see what the impact of a lack of friendship might be. William Rawlins, professor of interpersonal communication at Ohio University, for example, described it as including 3 key components: somebody to talk to, someone to depend on, and someone to enjoy. Whereas Dr. Diane Carson-Jones, a professor of educational psychology, described it as having the core provisions of intimacy, mutual assistance, and companionship. The American Psychological Association has a more dry definition, I'd say, where those involved tend to be concerned with meeting the other's needs and interests as well as satisfying their own desires. But I think one of the most clear and comprehensive is Mendelssohn and About's 6 elements of friendship. 1. Stimulating companionship, where you both participate in shared time and activities that you enjoy. 2. Help or social support. This can be in the form of emotional support, financial or practical support, or support involving advice or ideas for how to deal with problems you may be facing. 3. Emotional security, a sense of trusting a friend with your safety, to have your back as it were, even in different situations. 4. Reliable alliance, mutual and reciprocal shows of loyalty. 5. Self-validation, a level of support that lifts up a friend's sense of self-worth. And 6. Intimacy, the ability to be honest about sensitive topics, feelings, and fears. So we're looking at a relationship that's reciprocal, for some in a more emotionally intimate way, for others it's focused more on pleasure and enjoyment of their company. These similar but still distinct experiences of friendship are something I'm going to be digging into later in this video. But for now, the important thing to note is that on a very obvious and basic level, a lack of meaningful friendship is a path to loneliness. You can be surrounded by people, interacting with different people as part of your job for the majority of the day, so you aren't alone, but that loneliness can still persist with a lack of friendship. If we're seeing a rise in concerns about loneliness, we'd expect for either something to be causing that increase or for admitting to it to be more acceptable or accessible, exposing a loneliness that has been there all along. Last year, a worldwide Meta-Gallup survey, which looked at 1,000 people from each of the 170 countries that were studied, found 24% felt very or fairly lonely, with a further 27% feeling a little lonely. Although there isn't a direct comparison to how these people felt in previous years to see if there's been an increase. I found a research article named Loneliness Across Time and Space by Maki Lerman, which aimed to look at loneliness across larger time spans, and they found data on loneliness from representative samples from the past century are almost non-existent. This conclusion is drawn in part due to the fact that loneliness as a measure that was standardized in longitudinal studies is fairly recent, although I did find some smaller sample size examples. In England, the Annual Community Life Survey, a nationally representative annual survey of those 16 years and older, suggests that young adults aged between 16 and 24 had their rate of feeling often or always lonely rise from 8% to 10% between 2017 and 18 and 2021 to 22. But whether this loneliness loneliness is new or increasing or just something that people feel more able to open up about, the potential physical and mental effects for the individual remains similarly worrying, with evidence of rises in mental health issues, feelings of stress, and a decline in general well-being. From a physical health point of view, the link might not seem obvious on the surface. Loneliness is a mental state, right? But our internal psychological experiences can have a profound effect on our body. The expression worrying yourself sick is not without scientific backing. Stress hormones such as cortisol build up over the long term with chronic periods of stress and isolation, increasing the risk of a variety of health concerns. The American Heart Association, for example, released a statement in 2022 that social isolation was associated with a 29% increase to the risk of heart attack or heart disease death, and the 32% increase to stroke and stroke death. But this isn't just because of the physical effects of loneliness itself, but also because the risk factors for loneliness may well run alongside risk factors for ill health and vice versa. We've also seen in dozens of studies over the years the association between friendship and well-being, with the topic itself becoming the topic of an entire book, Friendship and Happiness Across the Lifespan and Cultures, edited by Melissa Demir, which includes chapters from over a dozen academics on topics like happiness at different life stages, millennial friendships in the age of social media, and specific looks at friendship in different countries from Algeria to Slovakia. The research review, Adult Friendship and Wellbeing, a systemic review of practical implications, compared results from research articles from 2000 to 2019. Individuals of all ages report being happier when they are with friends than when they are alone or with family members, and friendships are viewed as the most common source of joy. The presence of friendship ties is also associated with a variety of positive health outcomes such as lower mortality rates and a relatively long life. In a more expansive sense, a lack of personal friendship one-on-one can also lead to a lack of sense of belonging internally, as well as access to the practical positives of a community, having people to gather around who you can depend on, who are able to lend a hand or advice or support when something goes wrong. And this is a cycle that seems to keep running. The absence of the very community who will be able to be there for you when you have feelings of loneliness and depression or lower self-esteem is a big part of those feelings in the first place. And what makes it even harder is that there can be a very real sense of shame in having trouble making and keeping friends. Having no friends is often seen as more than just a problem to fix. It's also perceived as a moral failing, a source of deep embarrassment or pity, a personal ineptitude that says something very real and frightening about you. We see this in how desperate and embarrassed, or else how defiantly honest people are who open up about their loneliness online. Because it's not just the people that are experiencing this loneliness. It's also that there's an inability to express and communicate those feelings in a way that feels like it will be respected. Despite its importance, it's a type of interpersonal relationship that's been undervalued by many compared to other types of connection, romantic partners, blood relatives like parents and children, or even workplace relationships. People talk about the vital importance of family. There's a specific therapy and coaching type to help strengthen a couple's romantic ties. There's podcasts and LinkedIn posts and a bunch of research into workplace dynamics and structures. Going no contact with family is seen as having huge implications. Romantic breakups are treated with social respect, almost as a time of mourning, where emotional devastation is understandable. But what about friendship breakups? What if friendship troubles and concerns and issues to work through? I'd argue that we lack, at least in the English-speaking Western world, ways of talking about our own friendships, of codifying them, of labeling them in a way that feels universally understood. When we start dating someone, there's this agreed trajectory. There's vocabulary that you can use: dating, exclusive, girlfriend, wife. And having conversations about this, while sometimes intimidating, is expected. The infamous "we need to talk" line is so well known for a reason. It's expected that you'll have conversations about the relationship itself. But how do you ask someone if you're friends? How do you define the type of friendship that you have? How do you have conversations about the friendship? If we acknowledge that romantic relationships take work, that you might have fights but you work through it, that you have this ability to express a commitment to each other, why do we most often treat friendship so differently? A lack of labels or specific language wouldn't be a problem if we encouraged a system of open communication within the friendship journey, but for many people, both are lacking. And so we're left with this so-called friendship crisis. People who feel unfulfilled in their social lives, who crave types of friendship that they seem unable to form, who are left devastated by friendships ending yet don't know how to talk about it without being seen as overreacting. How does gender then play into this? Friendship and gender expectations. My friend's comment about the women in his life having these more emotionally intense, intimate friendships than he was used to seeing between straight men rang true for many of my own experiences. But I was interested to see if this was something that had been studied before, and oh boy, it definitely has been. I think partly buoyed by the whole straight people obsession with can men and women really be friends nonsense. The idea of gender divides in friendship are already in the cultural mindset in many ways. People had questions and the scientists were duty-bound to answer them. Incidentally, men and women can be just friends if they aren't fucking weird about it. One of the key differences, which seems to arise over and over, was the idea of intimacy. In the study Friendship and Gender, Perspectives of Professional Men and Women, Dr. Linda A. Sapadin found that results indicated that while both sexes viewed the characteristics of an ideal friendship in similar ways, their actual experiences of friendships differed. Women's same-sex friendships were rated higher for overall quality, intimacy, enjoyment, and nurturance. That struck me as particularly interesting, that the hypothetical components of friendship are agreed upon by everyone, but the experience in practice can differ. There was a study back in 1988 on the gender differences between American and New Zealander adults, Gender Differences and Friendship Patterns by Richard Orkett. By reissuing a survey originally done in a US college to students in New Zealand, he hoped to look at the differences and similarities there. Findings from this study support American research suggesting that women are more intimate and emotional in their same-sex friendships than men, and tend to place a higher value on these friendships than men do. In accordance with the findings of the American sample, New Zealand women emphasized talking, emotional sharing, and discussing personal problems with their same-sex friends. Men, in contrast to women, derived emotional support and therapeutic value more from their opposite-sex relationships than their same-sex friendships. That element of satisfaction from men in their relationships with women is telling to me. It isn't that men are finding intimate friendships less fulfilling. Clearly, this is something they value highly when evaluating their own experiences. So why is the difference in gendered attitudes to friendship occurring? A lot of research I found involved a similar set of questions and scenarios, essentially asking people to rate the behaviour of a hypothetical friend in a variety of situations, from friends cancelling plans to a friend refusing to confide in you emotionally. These types of scenarios have been used across different countries and age groups, with notable differences between the responses from participants of different genders. In one research article, Gender and Friendship Norms Among Older Adults by Diane Felmley and Ara Morocco, they looked at the results for 135 adults with an average age of 73 years and found women rated a friend who disclosed a secret as more inappropriate than did men. Women also expressed more disapproval of a friend who did not stand up for them when someone was critical of them, suggesting the expectations of friendship, particularly perceived loyalty in this case, differ between the two groups. Similar results were found in another piece of research by Felmley on college students on the other end of the age spectrum called Gender Rules, Same and Cross-Gender Friendship Norms. Women tended to have relatively high expectations for their friendships, whether with other women or men, results consistent with those of other studies on ideal friendship standards and expectations. But where did these expectations come from? I think the crux of our experiences with friendship and loneliness may well be tied to the way that we're encouraged and discouraged to form friendships as we grow up, particularly the way gender norms shape that area of our lives. The comparison from before about this idea of straight men never really getting over their first proper relationship, and how myself and many women I know growing up had the same long-lasting effects from friendship, I think it's not a wild jump to see these both as essentially the same experience. Someone being allowed to be emotionally vulnerable, trusting and intimate with someone outside their family, often for the first time. It's just that girls are potentially allowed that type of connection from friendship at an earlier age. I think about the way we structure play for boys and girls. Boys are encouraged to take up team sports, to play video games together, to build alongside each other. They're funneled into this path of making friends with bonding over shared experiences. Girls, on the other hand, are giving this image of the conversational tea party or the secret sharing sleepover. It's not just that on an individual level, girls are permitted to show vulnerable emotions more than boys. It's that that concept is baked into the ways we're taught to socialise together at all. Talking might happen in these active boy pastimes, but it isn't the point of them. The point is the shared activity. And although there are plenty of girls in sports and who play games, this doesn't necessarily replace the socializing specific activities they're encouraged to have too. The idea of men as leaders and women as nurturers, girls as cooperating and boys as competing, there are so many layers of stereotypes that are pushed onto us that can inform the ways that we experience friendship from the very start of our ability to construct friendships at all. And I think we can see ways that this follows us into adulthood. That study on older adults I talked about before had one significant scenario scenario where women were more lenient than men, namely when a friend in clear emotional distress would not confide their feelings. On the surface, this seems like men wanting to encourage emotional connection, but the study also took note of the participants' reasoning for their answers. And for these men, it turns out it wasn't really about emotional connection at all, but more a practically minded frustration. They believe that friends should talk about their problems so they can come to their aid. "It's better I know about her trouble," stated one male respondent. "I may be able to help." For women, this scenario appeared to raise norms of patience and acceptance of a friend's negative emotions, as well as norms of respect for privacy. Male respondents, on the other hand, seem to be more disapproving of a friend who does not share their troubles, because they want to be able to help or fix the situation as soon as possible. Thus, women's responses tended to reflect norms of nurturance and acceptance, whereas those of men depicted a more active helping orientation. So in fact, these results run in line with this delineation of friendship and gender that we've already seen before. And crucially, this connects with findings from other studies around the impact of the different elements of friendship, looking at the difference between emotional and instrumental support, because although both are important elements of friendship, it was also found that providers' emotional support, e.g. empathy, and instrumental support represent distinct dimensions of support provision. Crucially, emotional support, but not instrumental support, consistently predicted provider well-being. These two dimensions also interacted, such that instrumental support enhanced well-being of both providers and recipients, but only when providers were emotionally engaged while providing support. So when both people are emotionally engaged, then well-being increased. But if there was an emotional distance or detachment, then the friend getting the advice or practical support might have increased their well-being, but the same couldn't necessarily be said for the person giving it. That activation of empathetic connection, even in the form of practical help, was key. The question then becomes, even if men are more equipped to give practical support, are they allowed or allowing themselves to surrender to the emotional vulnerability that they are being discouraged from displaying to potentially get the most out of their friendships? I think we've probably all heard about the idea that we're experiencing a male loneliness epidemic of sorts. A topic that's become a talking point for everyone from legitimate mental health charities to incels dog whistling on 4chan. But when you see these studies again and again characterize men's friendship as having less space for emotional intimacy, it's clear that this isn't something to dismiss just because it's been latched onto by assholes. The Meta-Gallup survey I mentioned earlier also had findings broken down by gender, and they found rates of reported loneliness were similar between men and women. In most countries, there is little to no gender difference in rates of feeling lonely, but substantial gender gaps do exist in some places. Overall, there are more countries in which the rate of self-reported loneliness is higher for women than for men, 79 countries, than the opposite pattern, 63 countries. But I've also seen other research where the men studied were said to be more lonely. The meta-analysis Loneliness Across Time and Space, which involved studies across almost 400,000 individuals, concluded that this lack of clarity is pretty much the only conclusion that we can come to right now. Empirical findings on gender effects are inconsistent across single studies. Meta-analytic evidence shows that gender differences are small to negligible. Although there have been claims that women report a higher emotional burden with loneliness, suggesting that although there might not be a difference in the instances of loneliness, women might be more affected by it, I think it would be just as valid to suggest that there is validity in the idea that men might be less inclined to share the personal and emotional impact it's having on them. Perhaps if we track this trend of boys and men not being given access to emotional socialization, it might well be that many men talking about loneliness are not necessarily talking about something that they've lost, but rather something they're trying to create. We see campaigns encouraging men to talk to each other, to open up emotionally, to help improve their mental health. There are conversations about forging a new type of masculinity, memes about the boys as a wholesome version of male friendship, often hidden from a public discourse that prefers the image of the grunting locker room as the pinnacle of male connection. It feels like a lot of men right now are feeling freer to explore what friendship can be and what it can give them beyond what they've been taught. On the other hand, for many of the women I see talking openly about their loneliness and friendship worries on social media, it feels comparative to their own previous friendships, to the ways other girls and women around them are doing gendered friendship right. It's something that they're intimately familiar with and know that they are also expected to participate in. Ultimately, these gendered encouragements to do friendship in the correct way for your gender, to perform gender through your most intimate connections with fellow human beings, is harmful to everyone. I thought that this video would be strictly about women's friendship and loneliness when I first started to research, But then my findings started to drift into the impact on men as well, and it seemed to be a reasonable focus on the surface, looking at this heavily gendered conversations about friendship on the internet. There was a world where I sort of ended the video around here, but while I was researching and discussing the topic with friends, I kept finding these other elements of our lives that seemingly were having huge impacts on friendship, which intertwined with gender in many ways, that I needed to bring in to fully understand what is happening here. The modern practicalities of friendship. So let's think about a week in a typical adult life. It probably consists of working, commuting, feeding ourselves, and then keeping up with life admin. And for some of us, taking care of family or pets or children. Where do friendships fit into an already busy and overwhelming week? In an essay titled The Friendship Problem, Rosie Spinks writes about how friendships are starting to feel strikingly similar to admin, that we make plans with people ages in advance, scheduled around work and kids and chores and travel, and then more often than not, they get cancelled or rescheduled right before. She talks about how our adult friendships that are scheduled and planned are somehow failing to be the fulfilling intimate relationships that we desire, because we're lacking the week-to-week boring consistency that is required to maintain and sustain connection and community and closeness. I was talking to a friend in Canada who told me about her grandma being part of a women's group. Every week they would rotate around to a different house. They had no agenda other than just hanging out. They might work on crafts, they might chat, they might do charity work together, but overall the goal was just to have a weekly gathering with no point other than enjoying each other's company. Well, this was a different era, these women were working in the home, but it did make me think about how this kind of weekly connection is absent from a lot of our lives. It's this kind of routine gathering for no good reason other than just to spend time together that's seemingly missing from a lot of our lives that makes me wonder if part of the catch-up friendship phenomenon has to do with the way we've turned hanging out not just into admin, but into a kind of business meeting, scheduled and penciled into our calendars with a set location and agenda and time frame, with very little random spontaneous time allowed for consistent, casual, relational, low-stakes intimacy. And what's more is that because we're scheduling hangouts, even Zoom calls and chats, we don't end up reaching out of the blue so much anymore, too afraid to be too much or imposing on someone else's life, which just feeds into the cycle of catch-up friendships even further. On TikTok, author and financial advisor Chelsea Fagan talks about people being afraid of reaching out because it's increasingly seen as an intrusion, highlighting that the social system of capitalism has eroded the idea of favours, that we can simply call or show up for a friend whenever without a schedule because they're acts of love, not a service transaction. We've all heard the good old saying of trying to maintain a work-life balance being essential for our well-being, but how many of us can actually maintain that balance? How has capitalism eroded our sense of community and connection? Let's face it, more and more of us are spending more time on our work during the week, sometimes on weekends, at work, commuting to work, trying to catch up on work, thinking about work, or traveling between two different places of work, all to pay bills and just keep ourselves afloat. No wonder it's hard to maintain our friendships, let alone create new ones, even though it's exactly what we need to survive. The connections of loneliness and capitalism have been observed and studied by academics, activists, and journalists alike, all concerned with the ways that our modern world is failing us and our friendships. Sociologist David Matthews notes that individualism has always reigned supreme as a principle upon which the ideal capitalist society is instructed. He explains that individual effort, self-reliance, and independence are endorsed as hallmarks of capitalism. He points out that we as a society really celebrate individual successes. For example, getting a promotion or becoming Time Magazine's Person of the Year, which ties into the encouragement of competition above collaboration, which in turn ties into a society as a whole feeling lonelier and more disconnected. And what he's saying here really resonates with me. One of the first jobs that I ever had was at the tills at my local Tesco. It was one of the massive Tesco's where down from corporate we had the ruling that all 40 tills had to be open at the same time at all times. We were actively encouraged not to interact with each other while on the tills, to not form relationships. And the fact that these overworked managers were having to fit everyone's breaks together while keeping these tills open meant that we weren't going on breaks at the same time as other people, and definitely not consistently. There was no way really to form connections with the people that we worked alongside just a few feet away from us. Because time taken to socialize is time that you could be working, time you could be making a profit, time that you could be being productive. And after all, if you're spending more time with friends, sharing your emotional burdens, but also material objects and goods, then there may be things that you're less likely to be spending money on. In a highly individualized world, each household needs its own broom and shovel and vacuum cleaner, whereas if we're encouraged to create community with our neighbours, those things can become more communal in many cases. Things like hammers that you need only once in a while are something which just go to the person who needs it right then. Some climate activists have looked at the intersections of loneliness, capitalism, and climate change. Shelby, an environmental activist creator on YouTube, in a video titled "Consumerism is Making Us Lonely," talks about just this. That the system benefits from us being disconnected, lonely and individualistic. When a freak snowstorm in Texas left her without power for 4 days, she realised how our societal structure is so flawed that she wasn't connected to her neighbours because she'd never had to be before. But actually, she was living in a world where she didn't even have to care about her neighbours. She wondered what life would look like if she imagined and acted in a world that was centred around community, pushing past her social anxiety to make friends and connect with people and fight the capitalism-induced loneliness crisis. She talks about how, in doing this, it could solve climate problems too, by sharing resources alongside companionship, which reduce things like single-use plastics and overconsumption, which, while not the intention of this video, is, I think, interesting to think about, how when trying to work through why we're in a friendship crisis, we might actually find solutions to other problems that we're facing too. A final major part of our modern lives that I've not talked about yet in this section is having access to everyone all of the time on our phones and computers. With instant opportunities for connection, it seems like being able to go online would solve everything. Lonely? Call a friend. Need new friends? Find a meetup group. And it is true that for many people, having communication technology has opened up a space of friendship for them. In one study of UK teens by researchers Lizzie Winston, Becky Mars, Claire M.A. Hayworth, and Judy Kidger, the authors suggested that some of the features that are exclusive to being online, like not having to reply immediately and the absence of nonverbal cues like body language, can actually lower social inhibition and encourage more sharing. They found that these intimate self-disclosures can be beneficial to well-being and peer connectedness through enhanced feelings of support and trust. But overall, those that found the most benefit from using social media this way were the people who wouldn't necessarily have access to in-person interactions, like having friends who lived too far away or moved away, or those who didn't share extracurricular activities with. One of the most profound periods of intense onlineness that we've had in the past few years was, of course, the COVID lockdowns. And although this was a horrific time for the world in general, many people found positive and helpful interactions online, with research showing that during the enforced isolation periods of quarantine, technology and social media were tools associated with lowering levels of loneliness, anxiety, and depressive symptoms, particularly with people living alone. In a study titled "Young Adult Adaptability to the Social Challenges of the COVID-19 Pandemic, the Protective Role of Friendships," researchers focused on 20 to 24-year-olds. They found that during the pandemic, loneliness actually decreased, and participants reported having slightly more friends and rated the quality of their friendships somewhat higher. Now, these findings don't mean that the pandemic caused people to have more friends, or not being able to see people makes your friendships better. I think in a way it was because when the lockdowns were happening, we were talking about loneliness more. We were breaking down these taboos, and there were all of these ways that people were being encouraged to spend time socially online. It was also a time where a lot of people of this kind of age range were in jobs that they were getting put on furlough, where they were pausing their work, where they essentially were having more free time. And that free time that they weren't having to spend on just earning money to survive was free time that could go into friendships, into their relationships, into socializing, even if it was online. This points to how when online means of communication are used intentionally to check up on friends during the week or have these casual yet intimate conversations, that they can be great tools for combating loneliness and maintaining and growing friendships. But we also know that after years of being hyperconnected via social media, it isn't always sunshine and roses. One negative outcome is how friendship jealousy and social media has become just as intense for many people as more commonly talked about envious comparisons to someone's appearance or lifestyle online as an individual. Many folks on TikTok especially are highlighting that they're feeling loneliness and discontentment when seeing videos and pictures of any type of friendship groups, especially when the friends look like they're connected and care for each other. This passive consumption of an ideal or desirable friendship can give people an intense feeling of friendship FOMO, as it were, making them wonder why they aren't at an aesthetically pleasing dinner party with a dozen neighbours, or why they aren't having a PowerPoint presentation night with their closest friends. Not just that they aren't there in that moment or that they haven't experienced it before, But this idea that they wouldn't be able to, that the types of friendships that they have would not extend to these kinds of interactions, this kind of closeness that involves suggesting things, being vulnerable, relying on people to show up at a particular time for you. In the Rosie Spinks essay I mentioned earlier, she suggests that in the process of staying afloat in a globalized, connected world, we simply don't have the energy for the kinds of in-person, easy interactions that might actually give us some energy and life force back. Many of us are maybe more used to consuming curated versions of our friends and friendship than we are engaging actually with them in meaningful ways. And I think that a large part of this, the reason why so many of us are taking our friendships online, is because of proximity. Because at the end of the day, unless you're living nearby to your friends, working with them or living with them, our modern world makes it incredibly difficult to consistently see people just on a practical level. And that is something that is crucial to maintaining and keeping friendships. Life stages and changing expectations. Proximity feels like a somewhat self-evident factor when it comes to friendships. Like, you need to be close to someone to even meet them. But it's also a principle in social psychology. The research seems to confirm what we might just expect naturally. The proximity, which leads to both familiarity and frequency of connection, is a strong basis of friendship when your interactions aren't actively negative. This idea of proximity as a cornerstone of friendship building had me thinking back to my childhood experiences of friendship. During our school years, we're in a closed environment, in close physical proximity with people of different personalities and interests. You're most likely in the same schools or clubs and classes as your friends, with these external structures putting you in contact regularly, and may well, even if close enough to visit each other's houses and spend time together outside of this recurring contact. This type of relationship gets rid of the necessity for catch-up friendships because, for the most part, your lives are lived together. You know all the things that have happened because they happen to you too, like stories of what so-and-so said in class or how unreasonable your homework load is. They know your annoying little brother from the times that they've gone over to your house. They've seen your mum tell you off. They've eaten the type of dinner that you have at home. Little lived-in details are absorbed actively rather than being told about secondhand. And more than that, the proportional time of your lived life that you've spent together is huge. If you're 10 and you've been friends with someone since you started school, then it's 4 or 5 years. That's 50% of your life lived so far, and a higher percentage of your conscious life. There's no before the friendship life to catch up on, no law drop necessary, if you will. As a child, you're discovering yourself alongside your friends, crafting a real sense of self that may well be intrinsically linked to these friendships, the conversations you have, and the time and activities that you enjoy together. For those of us that go on to further education after school, this experience of a physical and temporal closeness continues, except now you have a stronger sense of self, of your boundaries, interests, and ambitions, and what kind of people you're compatible with as friends. You're able to seek them out, not just in tight-knit communal accommodations, but also in societies tailored specifically to your interests. You can go to the anime society or join a sports team or get involved in the film department and strengthen both your sense of adulthood and selfhood, but also connections with people similar to you. But as you leave school or university and enter into adult life, the likelihood that you're in the same place as your existing friends, physically and metaphorically, gets less and less. People return to their hometowns or even home countries, and even those you're in the same city as will likely not be in the same accommodation as you. In school, you're divided by your age into a set class. Then at university, you're mostly in the same life stage, maybe with varied experience in things like romance or part-time work around your studies, but ultimately in the same place for the same goal. But after you leave, you're divided by increasing social changes and differences that may well have been under the surface already. You may have vastly different incomes, as some of your friends enter lucrative corporate schemes, while others struggle to find employment at all. One of you might be in a long-term relationship with someone that you met at uni, and another might never have been on a date before. One of you might become a parent, and another might never want kids. These life experiences themselves might push people apart, but they also come with social expectations that exacerbate that. If you have a committed romantic partner in adulthood, there's an expectation that you will default to spending your time with them. If you're single, it wouldn't be out of the ordinary to spend more evenings on dates that you would seeing friends, especially as there is such a social importance placed on finding a romantic partner. Even if you might, without social biases, be inclined to see the people people that you have romantic relationships with and the people who have platonic relationships with sort of equal amounts, the presence of expectations might sway your hand, maybe from others outside of your relationship or even from within, maybe the perception of your partner that you don't spend enough time together, for example. This then subsequently can have a roll-on effect on single friends of married individuals. This year, the American Psychiatric Association released the findings on American adults' experiences of loneliness and found single adults are nearly twice as likely as married adults to say that they've been lonely on a weekly basis over the past year. 39% versus 22%. When you're in school, you spend your 9 to 5 in one place with a myriad of different peers of your own or similar ages with a range of interests. When you enter the world of full-time work, however, the 9 to 5, while still often in the same place, also often involves far fewer people in your immediate team or class equivalent. If you're wanting to make lasting friendships, and this is often a harder place to do so, there'll be a range of ages and life experiences that may just not be compatible. You're more likely to move on to another team or workplace altogether than you would have been to move schools in the same period of time. And you have the additional power dynamics of corporate hierarchies to contend with, putting a distance between those of different stages in their careers. There are also potential barriers of intimacy with colleagues. Might being totally honest with them change the way that they see you, not just within the friendship, but also in your place of work. This all-encompassing idea of friends who know everything about you is also simply more practical when you're young, and there isn't as much to know. Whereas it wouldn't be unusual for someone to have adult friends who you've known for years but have no idea how many siblings they have or what they studied at university. Making new friends then may be harder than it was in your youth, but maintaining them may also have added challenges. Life by its nature isn't stagnant. You may find yourself in a place at 25 where you have stable and fulfilling friendships, but that can change too, as these distances in literal or metaphorical proximity grow and shrink. I think these instabilities are compounded by our own past experiences. In adulthood, you have the memories and expectations of childhood to look back on. You can see what has improved about your life, but also what you miss from years past. If you had access to strong, impactful friendships in your youth and felt that you'd lost them along the way, might that make a lack of these kinds of relationships in adulthood hurt all the more? To have the whispers of those feelings of trust and vulnerability and connection seemingly now out of your reach? If we're thinking about life stages and friendship, we have to acknowledge that often these stages are experienced differently for people with different genders. Women are still often seen as the default caregivers to children, so parenthood might affect their friendships in a different way to that of their male partners, for example, but can also be affected by other elements of our identities, life circumstances, and experiences, some of which intersect with gender itself. The queer lens of friendship. Queerness is one of those identities and experiences that might affect what friendships mean and look like, for better or for worse. Research shows that loneliness is an issue that affects the LGBTQ+ community more acutely. Before the pandemic, 21% of queer people felt lonely very often or daily, according to LGBT Heroes' LGBTQ+ lockdown wellbeing report. During the lockdown, this more than doubled. This is partly because for queer people, finding community is made even more difficult. We have to look further to find peers that share commonalities with our identities, and things like coming out can often lead to isolation and even rejection. Plus, for many queer people, going out and finding queer friends can be dangerous, especially with the rise in hate crimes towards many in the community, and in particular towards trans, non-binary folks and queer people of colour. Plus, a lot of established queer community spaces are disappearing, with the example of lesbian bars closing being a classic one for the last few years, and people struggling to find consistent safe spaces where they can organise. There are also instances of how gender differences in friendships impact queer people in complex ways. I talked to a friend of mine who shared that having to hide that they were a lesbian made having close female friends even harder. They believed, whether that was internalized homophobia or fear, that they had to keep their sexuality from their friends because they thought that being a lesbian would ultimately end up ruining their friendships that they had with women. But if a cornerstone of these friendships was trust and emotional vulnerability, they were always aware that there was something that they were keeping back. There's also, of course, the experience of trans people whose assumed gender in childhood contrasts with their current experiences of friendship. This isn't something that seems to have been overly studied in academic literature, but look online and you can find so many stories across the internet of trans people expressing how they felt different about their friendships after their transition, sometimes about the ways in which they had assimilated to the type of friendship that was imposed on the gender that they were assigned at birth, but sometimes about in the ways that they didn't feel like they could fully fulfill that expectation, and that itself was part of their experience of their transness. In one Vice News interview, a trans woman, Kira, noticed that her girlfriends shared more physical affection with each other than they did with her, saying, "It's an uncomfortable conversation to have," she says. "You should hug me more. I notice that you don't hug me as much as you hug our other friends. I can't say that. I wonder if passing more as a woman would unlock some new level of friendship where they would let their guard down around me." Another example is a man, Roger, a trans man in a straight passing relationship, who says that the more that he presents as a man, the more his friends have become cis straight men, saying that men now view me as a candidate for potential friendship, whereas women tend to assume I wouldn't want to do the types of things that they might like to do, which isn't necessarily true. I grew up with 3 sisters, and mostly I still relate to people the same way as before. For example, I recently went and got mani-pedis with a close female friend. And I think there's something ironic here that this kind of strict adherence to gender expectations and gender norms is then imposed onto trans people, not just by transphobes or by people who are meaning it in a bad way or a confrontational way, but by friends who might consider themselves allies who think that they are validating that person's gender by imposing the gender stereotypes and expectations onto them. In one op-ed, writer James Barnes shared that he thought that he was ready for all the changes that transitioning would bring. Except, he writes, "The one thing I didn't prepare for was how lonely it is to be a man. Men started treating me like their guy friends, which was exactly what I wanted. What I didn't know is that male friendships aren't as deep. Before my transition, guys used to open up to me about all sorts of fears, frustrations, and feelings. Now they'd keep it superficial. Before transitioning, I didn't receive short pat hugs or shake hands. I got deep, long hugs. I didn't get quick answers about life. I got hour-long conversations." These examples highlight how socialized gender norms in a cis-normative world have created barriers and often straight up harm people looking to connect and make friends. And that for trans people, these gender differences have made their transitions even more complicated, having to navigate their feelings around these changing friendships and what it means and says about how people see them. But what if a queer lens, a shifting away from what straight society has normalized, could help solidify and prioritize making and sustaining friendships? Author Sophie K. Rosa writes about how dominant cis heteronormative culture actually robs and depletes us of friendship in many ways. She writes that, in straight culture, friendship is often something that is structured around the pursuit of romantic relationship, rather than a form of relationship with intrinsic value. Friends can be positioned as wingmen, as stag, hen do, and wedding attendees, as shoulders to cry on after a breakup. When people form nuclear households, friendship is often demoted further. Catch-ups might happen every few months at best. Worse, friendships can be treated as outright threats to monogamous coupledom. She notes that, of course, there are exceptions, that there are wonderful, flourishing friendships within the system, but overall our society has really turned towards a life that diminishes friendships as a less important relationship. She says that often friendship can and does look like different things in queer communities because of the likelihood of people already challenging binaries and assumptions that are socially accepted, of romantic versus platonic, sexual versus non-sexual, monogamous versus non-monogamous, partner versus friend, in ways that allow a reorientation towards friendship. So, for example, she talks about how polyamorous people can show that with enough intention, care, and communication, we might have the capacity to foster multiple committed relationships, which is useful when it comes to revalorizing friendship. She also mentions the idea of platonic polyamory, which is the possibility of multiple loving, committed relationships, not necessarily romantic or sexual, something different to the normative relational ideal of one partner and some friends. Similarly, writer Soel Sakar says that queer friendships that are built on a shared sense of belonging and care can be transformative. For Sakar, these friendships were places to explore who they were and envision queer futures together. Interestingly, she notes that in our society, the story being told about queer people is either based on an individual coming out story or romantic coupledom, which, as I talked about earlier, just contributes to this absence of understanding of how exactly friendships can or could work, because there are no example scripts to follow. But Sakar argues that it is in this absence that we can adapt, upending the norms of society and conventional friendship to decide what we want and need out of those connections for ourselves. What the hell do we do now? So I feel like I could end it here, right? In conclusion, the world is making friendships harder. It's not just you. I guess let that knowledge soothe your lonely soul. But what do we even do with that? I mean, it's all well and good if you can utilize this queer lens of the world and shift your friendships. The types of suggestions that I just mentioned are wonderful alternative ways of seeing friendships that might be gateways of opening up more meaningful connections. These changes could shift social norms, introduce new modes of interpersonal interaction, and radically alter the friendship and loneliness crisis we're facing. But those are incredibly big asks for our current world at large. Implementing these ideas may not be possible within the friendships that you have or the places that you live. Similarly, the problems that are created and exacerbated by capitalism aren't going away overnight, though, a person can wish. So while yes, it is important to be looking at the long-term vision of an idealized world, it's also necessary to take care of ourselves and other people who are affected by everything in the here and now. And when it comes to friendships, well, that seems like a lot of us. Ultimately, we don't need to wait for the overhaul of society to find ways of building fulfilling friendships. We can understand how modern practicalities like capitalism, social media, things like proximity and life stages all play into elements of friendship issues, but we can also use that understanding to try and work around them. Turns out, brace yourselves here, it might come down to needing to have hard and potentially anxiety-inducing conversations with the people you're stuck in an unfulfilling or catch-up friendship with. Part of the reason I think that this is a tricky thing to suggest is, as I've said before, we don't have easy access to shared language or conversation structures to have these discussions about friendship, but we're going to have to bite the bullet anyway, and not just calling attention to the fact of hey, I think we have a catch-up friendship, and then going back to that same pattern. It's going to involve talking about how to fix it, what you both want out of the friendship, and how you might work to get there. During the pandemic, I realized that a lot of my friendships were very one-on-one. I knew people as individuals that I'd met and gotten close to, but almost none of them were people that I knew from the same place who were also friends with each other. This has started to have the check-in effect, and I was aware that as lockdowns eased and people were back to working full-time with their commute factored in and the ability to go away at weekends and visit family, everyone was just going to be less available. So I decided to try and do something about it. I started a group chat purely for organising ways to bring my different friends together, honestly hoping that some of them would hit it off and end up being friends too. I hosted dinner parties where some people would arrive early to co-work or chill and chat, and we'd prep food together. Others would come after work, giving this very open community feel to the gatherings. When the weather was vaguely okay for the UK during the summer, we do picnics instead, with the first people arriving to stake a good spot before lunch, and often the last people not leaving until night was falling, with some people dipping in and out as they could and some staying the whole time. And it worked. I have friends who previously didn't know each other who are now super close. There are smaller pockets of these friendships that hang out nothing to do with me at all, people who have found shared interests and hobbies. That growing network of friendships couldn't have happened organically. I had to put effort into pulling together space and time to help them flourish, but it was absolutely worth it. And I think importantly, I was very open about what I was doing. I specifically let people know, hey, I'm worried if I try hanging out with everyone one-on-one as the only way we ever see each other, it would mean spreading my friendships too thin. I was finding myself forwarding the same WhatsApp message to a bunch of individual conversations, that I wanted my friends to find friendship in each other too. Friendship is often a relationship that's seen as easy and natural, but that won't always be the case. There may be hard conversations that you need to have with each other, and when we're talking about this sort of meta conversation about your own friendship, you may have to admit that there are aspects that are fundamentally not working, even if it's no one's fault. That compatibility is something that you need to figure out together, although we can perhaps see in the ways that these conversations have gone wrong a warning of how not to handle them. A recurring theme mentioned in many of the original TikTok comments and responses to the catch-up friendship videos was that there were so many people desperately trying to make connections and find friends or get closer to them, but that it just wasn't working. Some people pointed out that they feel like all their friends do is dump stuff on them and never show up for them in return, leaving them feeling used. Others pointed out that therapy culture might be a contributing factor. While seeking out therapy can be an extremely helpful thing, researchers have also pointed out that some of the complicated contradictions of therapy have found their way into the way that we think about friendship. One such article points out, therapy culture encourages people to seek out friends to whom they can disclose their most intimate feelings and experiences, friends who will offer support, understanding, and validation. But on the other hand, it also cautions us to maintain boundaries to protect oneself from friends' personal revelations or traumas. As a result, they argue that navigating modern friendships is difficult because of this duality, that sharing your personal feelings, dreams, and desires can be interpreted as building intimacy and connection, or creating a burden, or even both at the same time. I think a lot of people are caught in this kind of trap of wanting a close friendship but not knowing where the boundaries are, what a good friend or friendship is, and what friends owe to each other. Returning to that Chelsea Fagan TikTok I mentioned when talking about capitalism, she ends the video by saying, "I think that mental health talk is pushing us towards a world where we have perfect boundaries and no real friends." So if the current model of one-sided demands or boundaries isn't working, where can we look for models of what the hell to do to make our friendships more than check-ins? Well, some people are already doing just that. Many of the commenters on Chelsea's TikTok video and elsewhere online, and conversations that I've had with friends, point out that the individualized concept of friendship often feels tied to a trend within many westernized worldviews, that in other cultures and countries, this shift away from showing up for friends is not necessarily happening as much, where collectivism is potentially more valued. One commenter wrote, "I'm from an Eastern country, and my friend was shocked when I said I'd pick her up from the airport, a 2-hour round trip barely. Like, yeah, babe, that's what friends do." One of my own friends who's Pakistani, when I was talking about this topic with him, told me that people would just show up to your house. My parents always had this expectation of the house being nice and tidy because they wanted it to be ready. They wanted to be able to invite them in. This is an idea of community and friendship that existed in our not so distant past here as well. Remember my friend's Canadian grandmother and her gatherings. Our conversations with friends about what is missing can also come with ideas and suggestions taken from people who are living the types of friendship that we want to experience. An important set of communities to talk about if we're going to talk about developing what modern friendships can look like is the disabled and neurodivergent communities. Now, these communities are vast with all sorts of needs and experiences, but something that links many of us is being hampered by a lack of accessible ways to access and maintain traditional ideas of friendship. Some people literally can't socialize outside of their home at all because of problems with pain or mobility, and so they may rely on remote options and online communities if they don't have friends able to travel in their local area. Establishing meaningful communities that are safe and encouraging and foster healthy friendships has been a cornerstone of disability advocacy for decades. Others might have sensory or social needs that need to be communicated from the start, meaning that these conversations about how they want the friendship to go, how you might share time together, what isn't working, are already happening as an intrinsic part of that friendship. I think it's an unfortunate side effect of the wider friendship crisis, of people not being willing to put in the effort, that many disabled and neurodivergent people find that very part of themselves end up losing them friends. People they used to consider close fade out of their lives after a few too many times they have to decline an invitation for an activity that they can't go to, or get annoyed when a proposed venue isn't accessible. For many, they find that other disabled and neurodivergent people find it easier to empathise with what they're going through, and may well have more understanding of ways in which they might not be able to perform friendship in the socially normal or acceptable way. So how can we use these examples to create more fulfilling friendships for everyone? So I think to start, we need to be openly communicating what we would love to do for our friends. Things that we would consider not to be a burden and not to be too much. Just straight up explicitly say to your friends, "Hey, here are things I like doing or that don't exhaust me, that I would happily do for you." If you could drive, tell your local friends, "Hey, if I'm available, I'd happily drive you to appointments or to the airport. That way they don't have to spend money on a taxi and you get to chat on the way and help them out." Or maybe you have a friend with a specific life circumstance right now. Maybe they're searching for a new job. Actively offer to proofread their application letter or practice interview questions or come over for an evening of job hunting. Rather than just saying, "Oh, that sucks, let me know if there's anything I can do to help." Give suggestions. But you can also communicate what you aren't going to be good at or where your boundaries are so that the shape of your joint friendship is clear. Not everyone is the same type of friend with every one of their friends, and having people fulfill different parts of connection and community for you is very normal and good, actually. A large part of my anxiety disorder has historically revolved around not knowing if I am unwelcome or being annoying or burdening people, even just with my presence. And so friends being explicit about wanting to see me just like as a neutral default state of their being, so I don't feel like I'm imposing by asking if they want to hang out, has been really important to making our friendships feel a lot stronger to me. But so is knowing that if I was actually doing something annoying or that they didn't want company right now, that they feel comfortable to just tell me that and that there's no value judgment or hard feelings. The original TikTok creator of the catch-up friendship had suggested that online tools could help fight the phenomenon of loneliness by using social media more intentionally as a means of connection. More broadly, I think that we can use modern tools that we have at hand in a variety of other ways too. So you can figure out which methods and styles of communication you and your friend enjoy, for example. That might be group chats where you message any silly thing throughout the day, like you chat between classes in school when it's agreed that there isn't any pressure to reply to everything that is being sent. Or it might be that you are more into rambly voice memos so you can listen to your own personal podcast on the go. Or potentially each of you has a different preferred type of communication that you can combine in different ways. You might also want to utilize more casual video calls, from body doubling to getting chores or work done together, to baking, to watching a movie, to hopping on a Zoom call to break down the proximity barriers that allow you to get that social interaction in a low-key way that's already just part of your routine. I've done this before with group chats where one of us has a task to do around the house and we'll start a call and drop the link into the chat. And if anyone wants to join, they can, so it doesn't have to be a big organized thing. But maybe you want to create a regular time that you commit to connecting this way to make it just part of your everyday. I know that phone calls make a lot of people wince by even mentioning them. You know, who phones people anymore? But maybe that is a good reason why we should be phoning people, because it's just a good way to quickly say hello. A phone call doesn't have to be hours long. It can be a 5-minute chat to say you're thinking of them. Maybe you're commuting, would like some company, or on a walk. Or maybe you use it just to arrange an in-person meetup. Or maybe you hate phone calls, but communicating that to your friends and finding alternatives that create the type of friendship you both want is part of the work. One thing that I found super useful as someone who is freelance now is co-working with friends who are also freelance or maybe are able to work remotely from the companies that they work at. You can hang out at each other's flats or go to work in a nice cafe for the day and just create this supportive environment, even on a group video call where you don't have to be in the same place geographically. You can bounce ideas around, rant about work stress, and hype each other up for difficult tasks. But it's also important to figure out if a friendship just simply isn't compatible anymore, that your needs are mismatched and that there isn't a compromise you can come to, and to acknowledge that although there might not be the same cultural significance given to a breakdown of a friendship compared to the breakdown of a romantic relationship, that it can still be emotionally devastating to go through. And it's also important to come back around and revisit these kinds of meta conversations. Has what you've been trying worked? Do you still feel that fear of being too much? Do you realize that you see each other as activity friends who like to do things together, but you aren't naturally going to be the type of friends that go to each other with really difficult emotional decisions? Like, that's all okay. I think for me, maybe it's about trying to learn from our childhood friendships, rediscovering the potential joys there. Who says you can't spend whole days together with social time and activities, and maybe even a sleepover where you eat midnight feasts and talk about your secret hopes and fears? It's a question to ask yourself. If you were a kid again, what might you do to have that kind of connection and fun with your friends? How do you make the work worth it in the end? And what new skills, freedoms, resources, and emotional understanding can you bring to make your adult friendships even better? Thank you so much for watching. I would love to hear your thoughts about this topic in the comments, because I feel like there is so much to say. I was like, kind of almost felt like I was just scratching the surface there. And I feel like this is something that everyone has some kind of experience about. If you would like to help support me make videos like this one in the future, then you can join my Patreon. I will leave a link in the description if you want to check it out. There are some really fun perks, and I am super grateful to be able to do this, and that's because of people like you. And a final thanks to the sponsor of this video, Book of the Month. I will also leave links to my social media so you can find me all over the internet. And until I see you next time, bye.